bring in Michael Kaskey-Blomain right here on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline, who has an interesting piece up right now. Let's first get into some of the stuff Mike Scott said with MKB as he joins us now on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. MKB, what's up, my man?
What's up, Mike? It's going to be tough to follow up the great Mike Scott here.
Yeah, man. I know. Well, at least the dump button is clear, right?
Yeah, I'll try to be a little bit less explicit for you guys. I told Josh.
Yeah, he was pretty clear and pretty adamant that he would like to come back and be here. Now, obviously, that's what but you get the feeling that he's genuine. He said that coming to Philly really kind of rejuvenated him. Like, it gave him a little jolt, a little energy.
Yeah, well, first of all, Mike, I think, Mike's a pretty genuine guy. I don't think he would say that, something like he wants to be back in Philly if he didn't actually want to be back in Philly. It seemed like ever since he came here in that Tobias trade midseason, he, like you said, he genuinely enjoyed being around here. I think it gave him, I think he kind of felt like a forgotten guy with the Clippers. He wasn't, a huge part of that team. He wasn't really playing a big role. And by the time the season was over in Philly, he was getting national attention for the contributions he made to a legitimate championship contender. He has a nice role. His game fits nicely in Brett Brown's style of play. So, I definitely believe him when he says that he, wants to be back in Philly for sure.
Now, one of the things that he did say and admit was he felt that if they had more time together, that the result of that series could have been different.
It's tough to argue with him, Mike. I mean, that was something that, not just you and I, but a lot of people that discussed the Sixers talked about throughout the season, and that they just didn't have, the ample amount of time that other, teams had to kind of gel and get used to playing with each other. They had a lot of talent, and I think, a lot of those games in the playoffs, they were able to look great, and then a couple of the other games, they didn't look quite as good, obviously, and I think that was probably a direct result of, not having tons of experience playing together, and I think that, that's a good point by Mike, that a lot of people kind of feel the same way. If they had maybe a little bit more experience and time together under their belt, they could be, still playing right now.
Now, when you watch what's going on in this series, any takeaways from, things that the Sixers are, I want to get your opinion on this, Michael, because I'm watching this series. Now, I picked the Raptors to win in 6. I think the Raptors are just more experienced, tougher, better defensively. And what I'm now seeing as this series has gone on, I feel it is very similar to the Sixers versus the Celtics last year, where the Bucks are a very one-dimensional offense. They don't have shot creators. They aren't able to put the ball on the floor. They got guys who catch and shoot threes, and they're not athletic defenders. And I think that is really hurting them in this series against the Bucks right now.
Yeah,
against the Raptors, I should say.
Yeah, I would definitely agree, Mike. And I think you're seeing the limitations also of a guy that, is your focal point from a perimeter perspective that can't, consistently space the floor. And Giannis, obviously that ties back to something we've been, talking about with Ben for the past couple of years. When you look at Kawhi and the Raptors down the stretch of these games, especially Game 5 last night, which was, a really close game, Kawhi was able to generate offense for himself, by being able to shoot. He had a couple pull-up threes. He had a couple mid-range shots. And so much of everything that Giannis does is predicated on, driving directly into the paint and then either, making a shot for himself or kicking it out to the shooters. And ultimately that becomes, when you're a team that's as talented defensively as the Raptors are and able to make adjustments like you've seen, he put Kawhi on Giannis, who's done as good as a job as you can do. And then the other guys have been largely neutralized. So, I think you're starting to see, like you said, the experience of the Raptors really playing a factor in this series, as well as the limitations of, as good as Giannis is, he's still not quite at the level that we see Kawhi play at right now.
Yeah, and I think it's undervalued how good defensively the Raptors are. They gave the Sixers problems because they're tough. They like to make the game ugly because they have the best player. If the game's ugly and close, in the end, they have the best player. And I think it's a great strategy for them because they have the personnel to do it. It almost is like when Iverson was with the Sixers. I mean, they had Hill and Young, Hill and Lynch and Snow and Mutombo. Hey, you guys make it tough, play defense, and let Iverson do his thing. It's almost like the Raptors have that formula.
Yeah, they do, and they also seem to have really clearly defined roles in terms of what they're going to do, Mike. They know Kawhi is obviously their go-to guy on both ends, and they want Siakam to kind of be that slasher second option. Obviously, Lowry is an up-and-down guy, but they look for him to run the offense and knock shots down from the outside. And then they have a bunch of guys that just, know their role and do the things that they're, asked to do, and they don't necessarily try to do more. You saw that in the Sixers series, and I think you're seeing it even more in this Milwaukee series, where they're not necessarily super deep, but everyone that's been playing, substantial minutes outside of probably Danny Green, who's had a pretty rough series, has been, contributing in their own way to the Raptors.
Michael Kaskey-Blomain at The Real Mike KB on Twitter. He joins us here on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. Over at 973ESPN.com, you posted a bunch of free agents that you think that the Sixers should or could target or would be good fits, I guess we could say, for them. Now, let's first go through these scenarios. Jimmy Butler, your take is what?
That's, Jimmy's obviously, I think, the A1 for the Sixers, and pretty much the rest of their free agency plans hinge on, whether or not they're able to bring back Jimmy, who's going to have no shortage of suitors. You and I talked about this last week. It's really kind of hard to get a read on Jimmy and what he wants to do. I think he did genuinely like his time in Philly, but I don't know if he, liked it enough, and the people that are around him on his team, want to be in Philadelphia long term. Maybe they want to be in LA with nicer weather, but I think he'll obviously be a guy that the Sixers is, he's their first priority, and then everything else they do hinges on that. But, I think at this point, to me, it's honestly a coin toss whether or not he's going to be back. I truly don't know.
There's some, murmurs that he's being recruited by LeBron. Does Jimmy take you as the kind of guy that being wooed by LeBron would push his pile one way or the other?
I don't think so. He doesn't necessarily seem like the type of guy that would be interested in, being a sidekick to LeBron. Now, if it was a situation where he thinks the team is really good and a good role for him, he likes the off-court situation for the people around him. If that happens to be the Lakers, maybe LeBron giving him a call and being like, yo, man, I think we could, really accomplish some major things if you come out here. Maybe that could be a final, nail in the coffin, if you will. But I don't think if he's, really thinking about staying in Philly or, going to Brooklyn or somewhere else, that LeBron, calling him and saying, hey, come to the Lakers, especially obviously with all the, I guess dysfunction, if you want to say, going on in the front office there. I don't think that would necessarily be, a huge factor for Jimmy from what we've got to know from him.
All right. Tobias Harris, it's been reported that there's at least 5 teams that have interest in him. Is that worrisome, or do you think ultimately the Sixers' power to offer the most money still trumps those other teams having interest in him?
Yeah, I think the Sixers, in terms of Tobias, are still in the driver's seat, Mike. I think it'll depend on the contract, obviously, if they're willing to give him the max that other teams can't match. But I think he's another guy. Everyone that we've talked to genuinely seemed to like their time in Philly this year and wish that they had a little bit more time to gel. I think if the money's right for Tobias, I do think he'll be back in Philly. Now, if there's a situation where, they paid Jimmy a max and there's other, they're maybe looking to save a couple dollars on Tobias, and then there's teams like the Jazz or the Kings offering to give him max money, he's gone probably. But I think as long as the Sixers are, like Elton has said, they want to bring him back, it's probably going to cost top dollar. But assuming that they're going to be able to, they're, interested in doing that, I think he'll stay.
J.J. Redick and we just the aforementioned Mike Scott. Do you think that Redick and Scott, the chances of both of them coming back?
I think the chances of both of them coming back are pretty slim. I think Mike is going to have a lot of suitors this summer. Obviously you were just talking to him. I think he played himself into a position with the Sixers, especially during the stretch run in the postseason where he kind of showcased a skill set that's pretty relevant in the NBA today. And I think a lot of teams took notice and be like, hey, this guy would be, a pretty good piece coming off the bench as a guy that can spread the floor, guard, 2 or 3 different positions on the defensive end. So I think he'll have a lot of suitors. And if the Sixers, if they end up being able to bring back Jimmy, bring back Tobias, and bring back a JJ, I think there's a chance that Mike could get offers elsewhere that the Sixers couldn't match. I think JJ is probably a little more likely to come back at this point in his career than Mike is. He's settled in Brooklyn family-wise. He's, obviously been around the league for a long time. He's really grown fond of, I think, Ben and Joel and Brett and, the city of Philly in general. And he's gotten, obviously, a lot of money on the front end from this organization over the past 2 years. I'm sure they've had conversations of something along the lines of, we can pay you this now up front, but in a couple of years when we're, really knocking on the doorstep of contention, and some of our money's tied up in, the contracts for our rookie guys, and then some of these free agents, you might have to, bump back a little bit. I think that's something that was probably discussed and something that he might be okay with. So, all that considered, I think JJ will be back. But the odds of all four of those guys coming back, Mike, seems pretty slim considering that they have a lot of suitors elsewhere.
Okay, so if that doesn't happen, let's get into what's next. Michael Kaskey-Blomain at The Real Mike KB, 97.3 ESPN.com. All right, let's start with the top-tier guys. Kawhi, Klay, Kemba, Kyrie, Durant. Any one of those guys, do they have a conversation with that is realistic?
I think they might get a meeting, Mike. I think they might try to get a meeting with Kawhi. I think they might try to get a meeting with Klay or Kemba, depending on, the circumstances with those players' own teams. But at the end of the day, I think the Sixers are in a situation where if we're talking top-tier guys, it's going to be the incumbent players that they've already had on the roster. I just don't see, any of those guys. They probably already have, either they're going to stay with the teams that they're at and get the max deal. Like, the Hornets can offer Kemba a super max. The Warriors can offer Klay more than any other team. If those guys don't end up staying with their respective franchises, they probably have, a destination in mind already, whether it be, the Knicks or the Lakers or the Clippers or, some of these teams that we've heard mentioned a lot. It just doesn't seem like the Sixers are necessarily players for any of those top tier guys outside of, their own guys, which I think is another reason why it's so important for, Elton to be able to try to bring back Jimmy and Tobias.
Now, Keith Smith was on with us earlier. He does, earlier in the week, I should say, and he's very good with the cap and the numbers and all that kind of stuff. The understanding is, if they brought back one, Tobias or Jimmy, that they would be capped out to be able to go after a top flight free agent. So what's a better scenario? Bringing back both, one, or targeting one of those top guys?
I think probably bringing both back, Mike. I think, I didn't hear Keith. Obviously, he's really good with the numbers. From what I understand, I think in order – if they signed Jimmy or Tobias to a max deal, they would pretty much have to renounce, the rights to all the other free agents, meaning they wouldn't be able to bring back Jimmy or Mike or James Ennis or any of these other guys if they wanted to generate enough money for another max spot, which would then leave them, basically with no cap space for a bench or anything, which is, obviously not where they want to be. So I think in order to maximize the talent that they have this year, they're going to have to go into the luxury tax to keep Jimmy, to keep Tobias, and then, look elsewhere to get not these top-tier guys like Kawhi and Klay, some of the other, good, role player, contributor guys, but not these superstar-level players.
What about Boban, Monroe, Bolden? I mean, the center position behind Joel. Do they go back with that one of those guys? Do they look to upgrade that? And when I say upgrade, I mean, do they go out and legitimately spend some money? And I'm talking about like going into the realm of like a DeAndre Jordan. You mentioned a couple of centers on your list of guys, but do you bring back the Boban Bolden tandem and go that route, or do you look to really blow all those? I mean, Bolden's back no matter what because he's under contract, but how much of a role that could be different. But Boban or going out and finding a more defensive, athletic-minded guy?
Yeah, Mike, I think you got to basically throw out the center rotation they had this season outside of Jonah. Like you said, I think this summer will be really big for both Zaire and Jonah in terms of those guys could potentially take big steps forward this summer into a role where they're, legit contributors next year off the bench. But with that said, I think a legitimate backup center that can play both ends of the floor, consistently should be and is probably a top priority for the Sixers, especially considering the things that Joel said at his exit interview the other week, where he was talking about basically, moving forward, the team might have to do a little bit better job of managing his minutes, especially like early in the season. I think he played 54 of the first 58 games and was playing 35 minutes a game, which obviously, over the course of the year with Joel, you saw him kind of wear down in terms of the tendonitis and the sickness at the end of the year. So, I mean, if in order to really keep him healthy going into the playoffs, like we saw the Raptors kind of do with Kawhi this year, they need to have a guy that they can feel comfortable in, putting in that say, hey, this guy's going to give us 20 minutes and he's not going to be a huge net negative on, one end or the other, which was unfortunately the problem with their backups this year. You had, at times Greg Monroe looked all right, but then at times he would get torched. Same, sometimes Boban would be a force offensively, but then he was really exposed defensively against the Raptors. So I think you have to go out and get a guy that can, give you solid 20 minutes, and you're not going to, be a negative 15 in a 5-minute span that he's out on the floor.
All right, Mike, you've got 7 guys listed at 97.3ESPN.com. I'll run through a couple of them, get a couple quick hits from you. Marcus Morris. Now, he's a guy, some of these guys I agree with, some of them I don't. Marcus Morris would be a guy that I think I would be interested in, but would that mean Mike Scott is gone?
Probably, Mike. They're real similar players, what they would bring to the team. Morris is a guy that I think he's like, a lot of Philly fans dislike him, obviously, from these battles we've had with the Celtics over the past couple of years. But he's one of those guys, if he was on the Sixers, he's a Philly guy. I think he would be a fan favorite pretty quickly. But, I think if Mike's back, that nullifies bringing Marcus in. All right,
next on the list, oldie but goodie, bringing him back, Thaddeus Young. Philly's a city that loves to bring a guy back. Thaddeus is, interesting, like where he kind of fits in today's NBA. He's an okay three-point guy, not great. He's kind of an all-around versatile kind of guy. So who would be the casualty if you brought in a guy? Would he also be the Mike Scott, meaning he would not be back, or can they play together?
I think they would play together, Mike. Thad's such a good, a glue guy. When you have a guy like Joel and Ben in place, to me, Thad, that's what I always used to say about him at the time when he was here. He was here at the wrong time because they didn't have the foundational pieces in place for him to play off of. But now, he could play minutes at the 3. He could play minutes at the 4. I think he would play off of Joel really well as a guy that can slash and, give him a little bit of space in the paint. And, he could come off the bench. He could start potentially if let's say the team brought Jimmy back but wasn't able to keep Tobias, and you kind of have a hole at that power forward spot. He's a guy that could potentially plug in there and be pretty versatile. So, he's one guy that I think was a casualty of the process that was, really unfortunate in terms of he was a guy that could have continued to contribute to, the team once it turned things around.
Yeah, he's a guy that always is a hardworking guy, of course, with the Pacers right now. Another guy who was here during the process and has really turned into a nice reserve player in his time away from here is Dewayne Dedmon, a guy that maybe, people don't even remember his cup of coffee here.
Yeah, and he honestly, Mike, to me is I think one of the most realistic and potentially one of the most important targets for the Sixers, because when we're talking, about a replacement for Joel, we're not talking about, paying a backup center exorbitant amounts of money. We're not talking about getting an all-star center, but we are talking about getting a serviceable center that can play on both ends of the floor at a reasonable rate, and that's exactly what Dedmon has developed into at this point in his career. He's a pretty solid rim protector. He's mobile. He's decently athletic, and he's added. He can stretch it out to mid-range all the way out to the three-point arc if he has to on the offensive end. So he's a guy that I think, like I was kind of talking about earlier, you could put him in. He could sub in for Joel in the games where Joel's playing and give you 20 good minutes where you're not feeling like you're just treading water. And in some games, if Joel's out, he could, sub in and be a starting center, and you wouldn't necessarily be in a negative position with him out there.
Next on your list is Enes Kanter, who's interesting because he doesn't play a lick of defense, but he does score for you. Now, this team really struggled when Embiid went off the floor defensively, so Kanter would be an interesting fit for me.
Yeah, he's not, at the top of my list in terms of guys that I think they should pursue, but also the list of centers that fit the criteria of what I kind of just discussed in terms of, not top tier centers, but guys that are reliable and you can give minutes to. Kanter's kind of there. He's, certainly a huge step down defensively from Embiid, but I think he's showed in this, the playoff run with the Blazers that he's at least can hustle on the defensive end and make some things happen. And then offensively, at least if he's playing major minutes for you, he showed that he can, produce offensively for a center at a really high rate. So at least, if Joel's out for a few minutes and Kanter's, struggling on defense, at least maybe he could kind of neutralize that by giving you, another legitimate option on offense.
All right, couple more. Patrick Beverley. Now, he's a guy I would like. He'd be interesting, a point guard, but hard-nosed defense, does shoot the 3, 40%, so he would be a very interesting guy. But how would him and Ben work together?
Yeah, he's a guy I think you would agree with me that Philly would really fall in love with quickly in terms of, how he plays, hard-nosed, gets right up in your face. And I think his skill set would actually let him play off of Ben with or without Ben pretty well. He could play, with Ben on the floor and his ability. He's not, a knockdown shooter, I don't think you would say by any means, but he's right around, like you said, 40%. He can space the floor. He can drive a little bit, and he's quick. So he could play off of Ben, in transition in the half court. And then in times where Ben's on the bench, he could shift over and be your primary, ball handler and initiator of the offense. So he's kind of a dual threat in terms of how we would fit next to Ben. I think it would be a pretty solid fit, actually.
Danny Green, we're watching him, second best three-point shooter. Now, these guys are interesting to me. Like Joe Harris, number 1 in the league, really struggled. Danny Green, number 2 in the league, he's struggling. These guys who are these three-point specialists don't seem to translate as well come playoff time. So Green, if you brought him in here, that means who would be gone?
I don't know if it would necessarily have to be someone who would be gone, Mike. I think Green at this point it looks, obviously watching this series and his struggles, it looks like he's a guy whose days as a starter in this league are probably behind him. I think, he's kind of punching over his weight in the starting lineup in this series. But if he was brought into Philly, I think he would be a guy that you would bring off the bench for, let's say whoever, your shooting guard or small forward is that can come in and give you, 12, 15, 16 minutes a game of reliable defense and still knock down some shots for you. I think that's probably the role he's best suited for at this point in time. And with the Sixers having so few guys under, contract for next season, some of these guys that won't be commanding a big deal, but can still contribute is what they really need to look at. And I think Danny would be, one of those guys that would fit that mold despite how much he's been struggling, obviously, in this series against the Bucks.
All right, last guy on Michael Kaskey-Blomain's list is Curry. We're going to get Curry. Seth Curry.
Yeah, Seth is another one that I think is obviously, when you hear the name Curry, that, it pretty much gets associated with shooting immediately. And that's basically what he would be bringing to the Sixers, the guy that off the bench is just a straight up threat from long distance. The defense would have to respect. The Sixers obviously need shooters around Ben and Joel. They had, Landry Shamet did really well with them in the first half of the year. People love to talk about how great, how good Bellinelli and Ilyasova were for them in the playoffs last year as guys that were strictly floor spacers. So Curry's the guy who I think is really kind of coming to his own this year in Portland, obviously in that reserve role. He can run the offense a little bit. He can pass, and he can certainly shoot. So I think he would be a target for the Sixers to bring in as some, firepower off of the bench.
All right, very important offseason. It got moved up a day. It's June 30th now is when the free agency begins. We'll have an eye on it. At The Real Mike KB on Twitter for all the Sixers off-season news, the NBA playoffs. We've got Toronto and Milwaukee, Game 6 tomorrow night. Do we have a Game 7, Mike?
I'm going to go with, Mike. I said 7 initially, although the Raptors have looked really good, obviously, over the past 3. I'm going to say that Giannis will, get his MVP legs underneath him and pull one more out, and he'll send it back to, Milwaukee for a Game 7.
All right, Michael Kaskey-Blomain here on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. Your favorite summer shore stop is? Where's your spot?
Oh, man. I'm in AC a lot. My cousins have a house in Ventnor, so those are probably my 2 go-tos. I try to get down to Ocean City, Maryland a couple times every summer, so that's on the list too.
V-Boy, I like it. All right, Michael Kaskey-Blomain. Thanks, pal.
All right, Mike, I'll talk to you.
All right, Michael Kaskey-Blomain, like all guests, appear to be the Boardwalk Honda Hotline.